Thank you for being here to everyone in presence and online. Hello, hello. My name is Francesca Tarocco, and I'm the director of NICHE, the Center for Environmental Humanities, associated with the new institute in Hamburg. And today we are delighted to have two wonderful speakers, in fact, three, with our colleague Roberta Raffaetà, who's the deputy director of the center. Two wonderful speakers for the series New Books in Environmental Humanities. They are presenting this fantastic book, Reactivating Elements, which I'm sure will make important, it's advancing the conversation in our field and field that close to environmental studies and so on. So I will try and attempt to pronounce their beautiful names in an adequate enough manner. And we have Dimitris Papadopoulos and Maria Puig Bellacasa. Thank you for being here. And I leave my colleague Roberta Raffaetà, Professor Roberta Raffaetà, who many of you know, who's also teaching here in our MA for the Environmental Humanities and is an ERC holder for a fantastic project on health and microbes. So enjoy the talk and bye-bye.
So thank you, Francesca, and welcome everybody to this event today. We are really glad to have Maria Puig de la Bellacasa and Dimitris Papadopoulos with us. The book has been edited together also with Natasha Meyers, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but we're really happy to have you here. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce briefly because both of them has huge curriculum, and but I'm going to summarize and briefly introduce them to you. So, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa is Associate Professor at the University of Warwick. She works at the crossing of science and technology studies, feminist theory, and environmental humanities. She has been well known for her work on care and soil, and her most recent, she has published a lot, and her most recent book is entitled Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds. This book connects a feminist materialist tradition of critical thinking on care with debates on more than human ontologies and ecological practices. Maria is currently researching the ongoing formations of novel ecological cultures, looking at how connections between scientific knowing, social and community movements, and art interventions are contributing to social transformation. So thank you, Maria. And Dimitris Papadopoulos, Professor of Science, Technology and Society at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Nottingham. He works at the intersection of science and technology studies, social theory, cultural studies, and environmental humanities. Dimitris looks at technoscience and social transformation, as in his last monograph entitled Experimental Practice, Technoscience, Alter Ontologies, and More Than Social Movements. As well, Dimitris has a long list of publications and research interests, but he currently at the moment is focusing on new social and cultural research on chemical and elemental thinking. So I let you the floor, and thanks.
Thank you. So do I leave it here? Yeah. Thank you so much, Raffaetà, for this introduction. Thank you so much, Francesca, also, both of you, and NICHE for inviting us to come. We're very excited to present the book and to have a conversation with your community of thinking. And yeah, so we thought that we would talk a little bit about the general project of the book, and then the ideas and then address what we try to individually develop in our specific chapters, and that then we could have a conversation with all of you on whatever aspects you wanted to know more about, or things that might resonate with your own work, any comments you want to make, that, you know, anything that emerges. And yeah, so this book came to be because we thought that engaging with the elements would be a good way to activate thinking about more than human relations in the midst of the current environmental debacle and predicaments that we are traversing. And we thought also that we were basically very curious about the ways in which the elements are present today in technoscientific culture more generally, in a variety of ways. That is both fascinating because of the ambivalence and elusiveness of the notion of elements and the way, the different ways in which the elements are invoked might generate tensions. And maybe just to populate the landscape, to mention some of the you know, the initial thoughts about the concept and notion of elements that we try to bring together. So, of course, the elements can be understood in many different ways. You can think of the elements of the periodic table as a fundamental cornerstone of modern chemistry that most people, at least in the Western system of education, learn in school, and that are present in the ways we tell stories about how the world is made. And then we could say at the other extreme, or in another level of thinking, the elementals of ancient cosmologies. Obviously, we can think of the Greek elements of Empedocles, but also we have a different series of elements in Chinese philosophy. So the idea of the elements as something that is the foundation of everything that exists. But we can also think about the elements as weather. So the elements are also invoked as weather. And then you can find in these different notions transversal ways of understanding the elements, which is elements as media, so as the media that supports other things, elements as part of wholes, but also as being irreducible wholes in themselves, so being elemental to something. Elements as substances, and obviously you could think the elements themselves of the periodic table can be thought as elements of the substances, but also some of them as substances themselves. But then there are other ways of thinking, like the elements as commons. So how the politics of the commons are invoking some of basically what could be called the elementals: earth, air, water, as something that is elemental to the life of everything on earth, and therefore is somehow sacred in some way that allows us to think that we need to protect it and consider it in some way inalienable or inalienable. I don't even know how you pronounce that, but something that is to respect and to take care of for the common good. And basically through all of that you have the notion that the elemental is essential, basic, and vital. So these are there are cornerstones of systems, cornerstones of thinking. And the elementals in this way are, of course, a schematization, an abstraction of the natural world, a way of making meaning by generating a sense of what is essential to life. Now, for us, the project started as thinking, we want to explore the thinking landscape between these potential ways of connecting between these different ways of understanding the elements as a field of possibility. What is possible to think when these dimensions are allowed to communicate or allowed to diverge or to enter in tension in the context of contemporary technoscience? And we've started with approaches that were grounded in the field of STS, Science and Technology Studies, but basically, and you can see that in the contribution of the book, these are the contributors are people who work in the field of STS in a very wide and undisciplined way. So some of the contributions, you could also see them as environmental humanities, as overlapping. And of course, these two fields are intrinsically connected in many ways, at least in the way we work through feminist approaches. But you can find also in the book people who have engaged with media theory, crowd theory, so different disciplines and approaches and problematics enter in the book that are obviously not limited to what some people might think STS is today. So we saw it as an open invitation to some scholars that we knew through the STS community, who we thought that we see them as people who are quite experimental in their thinking, and that we invited them just to engage with the notion of elements from any perspective they would want. And the aim was to trigger, at the beginning of the project, we said, let's trigger what could be element thinking. So obviously that has the ambivalence of saying the elements are thinking, and we are thinking something that is the elements, or we are thinking with the elements. So it was really very, very open. And also, obviously, these were not like, we didn't just choose them because we like how they thought. Many of these people had, if not engaged with the notion of elements themselves, so basically none of them had really engaged with the concept as such, but their work could relate in one way or another with this inventory of ideas of the elements. So Tim Choi's with suspension in the air, and Joe Dumit with pharma, and Corey Hayden also with pharma. I mean, I cannot mention them all, but Stefan Helmreich, ocean as water, and media, the ocean as media. So the result is this book, and we saw it as a reactivation because we thought, obviously, we didn't think the elements is a new thing, and we are not really interested in saying this is a new thing. It reactivates in the sense that we see it as getting involved with some questions and understandings that may be commonplace, so they might sound like commonplace ideas. For instance, the elements air, water, fire, seems something as everyday commonplace in especially in Western cosmologies. And but we thought that reactivating this that might seem outdated into a present would maybe invite to different rearrangements, and that will make also these different understandings activate each other. So we played with the idea of activating also like in a chemical way, reactions. Chemistry speaks of reactions, things react to each other, reactivate each other. So I mentioned already that the grounding of the thinking was in STS, and many of the methodologies are typically
Okay.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, that one of the things that we saw emerging on all the chapters basically was that many of the chapters had concerns that were quite, let's say, related to the conditions we are finding ourselves today. I mean, there is maybe a citation that I was looking for things. There was one in one of the first chapters that maybe says this a little bit in the Isabel Stenger's chapter, and she said, if there must be a reactivation of elements, it should unfold in other very different ecologies. And obviously she means by other ecologies than the one she's discussing the periodic table, the way the periodic table was created and thought, and that the ecologies today are very, very different from the ones in that moment, that in the way they were thought first. And she says that reactivation must reactivate a colloquial use of the term element, and then she mentions unleashed elements such as devouring flames, destructive cyclones, devastating inundations, mud flows, and landslides. The ancient four elements may well regain the wild power which was supposedly put under control and now thrive on the anthropogenic transformation of earth ecologies. So one of the things that this was not something we thought at the beginning in this activation, like many of the chapters in the encounter between the chemistry of the elements and the elementals thought as these not natural bodies, what science would call natural bodies that are more like wholes. This kind of unleashing of the toxicity, all the questions we are envisioning today in terms of environmental destruction came quite to the fore in the book.
So I think I'll stand up so that I can see you. So Maria has introduced the main themes that run through the book, and I want to talk a little bit more about the why, the thinking behind that. And I think the main background and the main motivation for us is to think and possibly break the distinction between elements, the elements, and the elemental. And I think this is a quite crucial distinction, and this is what the book and most of the authors in the book discuss in different ways. So if you think the elements appear in many different forms in the book, as chemical categories, as forces and energies, as cosmological entities, then as material objects or things, as social forms, as experimental devices that we use in labs or in other scientific settings, as formations of matter, broader formations of matter, as cultural tropes, everyday stories. We have a lot of elements, and there are a lot of stories that come from the appearance of the elements in everyday life, and of course as epistemic objects. And this mostly within chemistry, chemical engineering, engineering more broadly, but also in the biosciences, plant sciences, and so on. And I think most of the chapters here, and it's very difficult for me to go through all these chapters and tell you how they address these questions, because I would need much more time than I have. But all of them, Isabel Stenger's chapters discussing the elements in the periodic table, then Stefan Helmreich's chapter and Joe Dumit's chapters approaching the question of the elemental and how different elements, chemical elements, change and move through different media, be it waves, water, or different scientific contexts, as Joe does in his chapter. Astrid and Joe discussing different iterations of the elements in different environments. For example, Astrid Schrader discusses the distinction between life and non-life and how chemical elements play a role there. And then Joe Masco discusses the ubiquitous chemicals that came to live much longer than we ever thought they would live, and they would be present, and how they are changing our understandings of time. Patrick Bresnihan talks about the elements in relation to elemental forces, such as air. Corey Hayden, in a wonderful chapter, discusses the elemental in the social. So what is elemental social forces? She thinks with crowds, and she connects his work to today's illiberal, or if you want to call them post-liberal societies. And then we have Maria's work. I won't say much because we will talk about our chapters in a moment. Theme choice, multi-media work where he brings together drawings and text and social science analysis to discuss the idea of air and breathing air, and how our experience of breathing air connects us and divides us simultaneously. And then the last chapter is Michelle Murphy's chapter on rethinking, I think, an emancipatory idea and politics of elements. So now all these iterations of elements constitute what elements are for many of us and from many different ways, and point towards a distinction between the elements and the elemental. And this distinction for us is something that we try to overcome. We try to overcome the binarisms that exist in thinking with the elements, between substance and chemistry, for example, or between epistemic understandings of chemicals, such as in chemistry, and then cosmological understanding of chemicals, such as traditional knowledge systems, for example, the nature aspect of chemicals and the cultural aspects. We want to move outside of this towards something which we would call the nature cultural with Donna Haraway, of course. So the book tries to think, how do we reposition elements within the elemental? And when we talk about the elemental, we think of the broader conditions, the broader ways, and these are, of course, social and environmental, social and ecological, in the same time, that we, together with the elements that exist before us, and the many molecules and compounds that we produce, these anthropochemicals that are human-made, how we inhabit the elemental. And breaking this distinction and moving the elements outside of the elements to the elemental is not something that can be done easily, in the sense that it's a matter of thinking, but it's more of a practice, and it's more of a practice that is out there. So I think in the book, the way we approach the elemental is less about what is the elemental and more a question about becoming elemental. And I'm not using the becoming elemental as a kind of fashionable phrase or something that sounds nice, but I'm using it as truly a political, a social, a scientific challenge when we engage with chemicals. So what does it mean to take an element and to think it in a broader context, which is the elemental? So how do we move a chemical out of its small niche and into something that is much broader, as you do actually with niche, and think it in this broader context. And I think this is the challenge also for chemistry, and I'll talk about this in a moment when I talk about some of the work that I present in the chapter in the book, which is a move outside of this compartmentalization of chemicals into a very specific, or elements, in a very specific way of thinking. So just to finish this, the broader why, so what is this becoming elemental answers to? And I think for us, or at least for me, when we were thinking the book together, for me it does two things. It answers, in the one hand, to many positions out there which demonize chemicals, and of course it's understandable. There is pollution, destruction, environmental degradation caused by different molecules and materials that humans make, and we can easily say we need to disentangle us from the elements. But the becoming elemental would question that. How do you disentangle yourself from something that is part from the broader movements of matter you are already part of? And the other aspect that we try to answer is the polar opposite to the demonization of chemicals, which is the cultivation of the ideas that we could at some moment, and possibly very soon, produce some chemicals that are green, sustainable, and with green innovation we'll move to new transitions. So on the one hand, the quite often position that human-made chemicals, especially the ones that we create within the system of production that we have now, are inescapable, and we cannot, and we need to distance ourselves from them. And on the other hand, we need to embrace them and move with them. And I think the becoming elemental is tries to discuss these two polar opposites and think, I wouldn't say propose, but think ways of how do you move the chemicals in a way that mobilize different energies that are parts of these broader systems, which are the systems of the elemental.
Okay, so before maybe I just add something to what Dimitris said, and is that we didn't aim to have a kind of theory of the elements or nothing like that. So if you look at the book and you try to find like a homogeneous idea that, you know, this is what elemental theory is, and there is also, I wanted to mention by saying that there is also, of course, work that has been developed on thinking elemental theory, for instance. You find that in ecocriticism, and you find that also in media theory. So it's not like we thought we were bringing something that is completely different or another theory. So but we wanted to start this conversation from where we were and with the questions that, you know, situated us. And so the result of the book is obviously situated in this particular arrangement of these different people that come together to talk about it, and it has the particular political, social, but also intellectual influences that we bring with us. So basically, yeah, I want to just say that it's not about creating some kind of new theory of something. So we have several ideas that we wanted to explore together. So I think that's what we wanted to share about like the initial project and what's in the book generally. And then we thought that we would talk a little bit, each of us, about our chapters in the book and how did we, because we also, in a way, had to do the same. How do we engage? What do we do with the notion of elements? And I think it's quite interesting to show the different ways, because we came from very different standpoints to look at what elemental could mean. So basically for me, this project became an opportunity to explore what could come out if we thought soil as an elemental. And obviously you can think of soil as an elemental from the perspective of, as a proxy of the earth element, of material spiritualities and elemental cosmologies. So when you think of the earth element, often it refers to earth as the earth, as terra, as the soil, and it also refers as of what grows on the soil. So by distinction of what's in the air, what's in the water, what's fire, for instance, in elemental cosmologies. And for me, it was like, if we take soil as my element, let's say soil is my element to play in this project, I'm going to have to bring also an seemingly antithetical ontology, which is the elements of chemistry. And that's because on the one hand, we have soil as I say, the matter of the land, this matter that permeates the naming of this very planet, the ground we stand on, with words in many languages that are synonymous or share significance with soil, obviously in Italian, in Spanish, terra. And soil also as this elemental common, as something that is the main reason why there is land grab, because it's the resource that we need to grow food on, and that obviously becomes the reason why you know, it's a quite interesting element to think colonialism through the way this, you know, the fertility of the soils that are colonized, and why obviously the soil as a resource. You can think also of water wars, but soil is a fundamental resource in terms of the natural resources that are both essential, but also let's say the object of capitalist accumulation and colonialism. Giovanna Ricoveri, one of your compatriots of the Italians in the room, has developed her theory of the natural commons using the 5 elements of Empedocles for that, using to think about the elements, the elementals as this, as I said before, inalienable wholeness, some things that even scientists would call that a natural body. But from the idea of the elemental commons is about also that these are vital media that are necessary for life and that shouldn't be appropriated by any means. So that soil is part of that thinking. But besides that, we have the fact that soils materially are intrinsically involved with the way the elements of chemistry, the ones that chemistry studies and puts in the periodic table, circulate on Earth. Elements such as all the chemical components of material compounds, the compounds we are made of, carbon, oxygen, and specifically, this means that soils are a fundamental medium that is working to circulate those elements through Earth in a multi-species arrangement. It's a biochemical process of cycling elements on Earth passes through soil. The examples that are more common and more known are carbon, obviously, so the carbon stays in soil. The way we treat the soil changes the way carbon circulates. So there is a lot of thinking today in science, policy, and practice about how to keep the carbon in the soil so that it doesn't contribute to global warming, how to sink carbon in soils. Nitrogen is another one. Soil is a fundamental media for the circulation of nitrogen, not for 2 reasons, basically because we put a lot of nitrogen fertilizers on the soil, more than the soil needs, which means that they leach into the waters and they create a lot of problems, pollution, eutrophication, but also because without that, even before we had nitrogen fertilizers, in the soil, a lot of nitrogen is produced through the work between microorganisms and roots in plants, and that's what also gives nitrogen as a natural fertilizer. So there is all this elemental circulation in terms of the elements of chemistry. Soil is also a medium where through all these participate. So how I was, my task for myself was, how do I think together this, and what happens when I think together this? So starting for me was obviously in a context in which human-soil relations, which is like my object of study, let's say, broadly understood, how the relations that we have with the soils are changing in the context of technoscientific societies, which is a context in which soils are struggling because of many reasons: loss of soil fertility, soil pollution, and you name it, soil erosion, etc. So, but for this particular chapter, obviously the predicament, the ecological predicament of soils is that this vital elemental recirculation to which soils participate, that soils actually activate, soils as a multi-species world where all these microorganisms live, is being damaged by the generation and excess of chemical manufactured compounds, or what Dimitris calls anthropochemicals. And these are obstructing this recirculation and altering. So in other words, the industrial manipulation of those substances that science has typified, abstracted as the chemical elements, is threatening soils in their elementality. So soils in their elementality as they are elemental for life on Earth. So I tried to look at how this was changing, how how could we see these disturbances and how people are engaging with these disturbances in different ways. So for me in this discussion, what became a notion that became key for me to generate a speculative articulation between these 2 spheres of problematics was exploring what can we learn from soils about regenerating circulation. How can we regenerate circulation there where it's obstructed? What can we learn with soils? And that's a very typical theme in the environmental humanities. How do we learn from more non-humans about our own way of existing, and not only the environmental humanities? Like, I'm very interested in earth-based spiritualities, and earth-based spiritualities are all about how to live in a way that we are also like part of this earth, in a way, like in the way we live. And that's where the notion, and my chapter is called, I forgot, Embracing Breakdown. And that's where the notion of breakdown comes in. That's where, for me, I found a way to connect those. So the first thing to say there is that soils are per excellence, the epitome of vital processes of breakdown. So soil itself is the product of the breakdown of rocks and organic matter. And in a way, breakdown is another word to talk about what scientists call pedogenesis, which is basically the creation of soil. The genesis of pedo is Latin for soil, and so pedogenesis. And this is a multi-species achievement. Soils are created through the breakdown of rocks and organic matter through the action of microorganisms and the weathering of the elements. So soils are in themselves the possibility of their fertility, the result of the requirements, one of the vital requirements on this earth, and is the breakdown of compounds of matter into elements again to be recirculated. So basically, life thrives on the breakdown of life. And that's something that this chapter explores. I've already talked 10 minutes. Okay, so let me just very quickly to say that, of course, breakdown is a metonymy for a range of processes in different sciences. So the biologists, we talk about decomposition, cleavages in chemistry, oxidation, geology. In geology, we talk about weathering. So breakdown for me became an exploration of imaginaries of breakdown through science, but also through practices in human soil relations. So this in the chapter I develop how the notion of breakdown is at the heart of two things, and I finish with that. One is a range of practices that explore our material affinity with of breakdown are sometimes idealized because they discuss these biochemical interactions that happen on Earth, on life on Earth, in a very idealized way. And the way that we talk about the cycles on Earth are often idealized from scientific ideas. And obviously through also in Earth-based spiritualities, through schemas of how we would want to live. So it's ethical, idealized concepts. So the fact that we talk about composting the organic matter that we produce and the whole range of practices of composting that have exploded in the last 10 years, they also thrive on these ideas that the cycles are somehow working. But then if you think about that as also through the idea of affinity, of this material affinity, what the chapter is about is how do we turn this feeling of affinity with the soil into not only embracing the fact that we are part of this breakdown, but engaging in assisting breakdown. What does it mean to assist breakdown? And what does it mean to think from this practice of assisting breakdown into thinking the notion of breakdown itself as something that is part of how we live and how do we break all this stuff that we've made down? What does it mean to decide that we want to break down the range of compounds that we have created? It's somehow for me a way of exploring how life has been equated with production, creation, endurance of things. And what does it mean to start thinking that we have to make space for the complete opposite, the fact of that we need to break a lot of what have we put on Earth down. So that's a little bit the provocation that this chapter is about. Sorry, I took 4 minutes more.
And in my chapter, what I try to do is to explore the relation between chemistry or chemicals, actually. To see the environmental chemistry or ecological chemistry, where we try to trace the effects of pollution on global systems, global environmental systems. But here again is thinking chemicals and what their implications are on the environment or on ecologies. But it is not about thinking the ecological in the way we make certain chemicals and molecules. So in a paradoxical way, although chemicals are always ecological, ecology is absent from chemistry and chemical practice. And I'm trying to think, what does it mean to do that? What does it mean to bring ecology back into chemistry, into chemical practice? And I call this the milieu, when chemistry becomes aware of its milieu, which is the socio-ecological, the ecological milieu, in which it is part of. And we start thinking of the making, the production of molecules, both on lab scale and later in industrial scale, with considering the ecological constraints that are put towards the process of making of these chemicals. So bringing the milieu back into chemistry is the argument of the quest and the argument of this work, of this chapter, of this paper. And I think there are different ways that this attempt is pronounced today, because again, it's a specific way to think of the becoming elemental. So bringing the milieu into chemicals is one way where we think, how do we think elements and the elemental together? And then I start discussing green and sustainable chemistry, which is a formal subdiscipline of chemistry, as an attempt of some scientists to think the ecological, with severe and important limitations, but with lots of possibilities, of course. And I discuss how this happens already when we think, and some of these green chemists introduce the idea, for example, of atom economy. So every part of the reactions need to be used, and we cannot discard atoms from a reaction. This is something that perhaps today is something that we would think is necessary, although not many chemists still today think of this, but many would say this is obvious. But it happened only in 1991, and a few years later, I think it is 1992 or 1993, Roger Selden, who is one of the founders of green chemistry, formulated something that it is called the E factor, the environmental factor, which is the ratio between the mass of waste and the mass of product we produce when we produce a chemical. And you think it is 1992 when somebody in chemistry thought that we need to account for the weight we produce. And the amount of weight is staggering. So for a few kilograms of API, so active pharmaceutical ingredient in a medicament, we produce 1,000 tons of waste for just, I think, 1 kilogram or a little bit more than 1 kilogram. We produce 1,000 kilograms of waste. So the ratio is staggering. It's less high in bulk chemicals, but the mass and the volume of bulk chemicals is so big that it's still huge. So nobody thought of waste before. So green and sustainable chemistry is one way to bring the milieu back into chemical practice within chemistry. But for many reasons, there are severe limitations, and the reasons have to do with valuation. What has value when you make, produce, use, discard, and circulate chemicals? And there are classes of valuation happening there, limiting actually the work of green sustainable chemistry. And then this brought me to think, so where else do we try and does this reintroduction of the milieu into chemical practice happen? And I started thinking and exploring chemical practice outside the lab, chemical research outside the lab in many non-instituted spaces, and what does it mean to create a chemical practice that engages in intensive ways with its milieu and its ecology. So this is a very brief description of this work. I think that's the end of our presentation of the book. I want to say that we are grateful to all the people we work with and all the contributors to this volume, because the inspiration actually for making this book comes from them and from many other colleagues who are not in the book. But we've been in discussion with most of them, many of them for many, many years. Most of them are colleagues, interlocutors, but also friends. So we are grateful for their contributions, and it's really important for us on a collegial and a personal level that they are there. And we are grateful to Roberta for inviting us and for this collaboration. And also, Francesca, thank you very much. It's a wonderful place, and we are very happy to be
And thank
here.
you to all of you for being here. So,
I forgot to say at the beginning that, of course, this is a dialogue, right? So whoever had a question can intervene. And also from home, sorry, I know we had some connection problem, but I hope it was not too bad. So whenever any of you online has a question, just put your name in the chat and we will give you space for your question. While maybe you are thinking, because I do not see yet any hand raised, I have just few comments. So, first of all, wow, thank you so much. You know, you gave life, they gave life to chemicals, which is not an easy task. I mean, I don't know about you, but one of the reasons why I went into the humanities is that we kind of ate it, right? Like these dry sciences like math and chemistry, this periodic table, only the name made me like give me fear of these memories of school, of remembering by memory, you know, this kind of knowledge is really dry, really empty. And here you are giving life again to something that is basic to our daily life, that we do not only, it's not the elements, the chemical elements are not just out there, we are also elemental, living in an elemental world, connected to social, political dimensions. So I think your book is really important because it opens up all this empty and dry space and make it live with us and with our affects, emotions, bodies, and everything. So I think this is a very important contribution, especially for this place that is niche. And NICHE also has a master course in environmental humanities, where we really try to weave together the life sciences with the social sciences and humanities. So this is it's very good contribution. And I have a question. So the element concept, I think it brings into question the very categorization practices we are used to, because it molecularizes, it fragmentates, more broader categories we have in mind, as for example, the species, the human, the non-human, and so on. So I was curious to hear from you. You already mentioned a bit, but maybe if you can elaborate, which is this elemental thinking that you are engaged in the book, how it is in relation with multi-species and post-human terms. So thank you very much.
Your chemistry side. Maybe we can do both a bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are many traditions that are present in the book, traditions of thought, and they are related in many ways to the different trajectories of the people who contributed to this volume. And there are traditions located in anthropology and in the anthropology of substances and materials, but also in material anthropology. I think this is very present in the book because a lot of the authors trace material objects into the lively existences and how they compose and decompose and recompose. And I think this is very present. Of course, critical, cultural, feminist science and technology studies is an intellectual tradition that is the background of the work presented here, but it's also the horizon in a certain way. It's a contribution of the volume towards this field. And we thought of this as a contribution primarily to critical, cultural, feminist science and technology studies. But beyond there are traditions from social theory, post-human theory, elemental theory that have informed much of the work there in our thinking. And we actually learn from them. I wouldn't say that I produce something that speaks directly to elemental theory. I wouldn't say that my work, but also the work of many of the people here is more in discussion with elemental theory, and the way that elemental theory travels through different fields. So, for example, elemental theory in literature has been an important part of our thinking for this book. Ecocriticism, environmental humanities, but also media and elemental media and elemental theory in media studies is also another way to bring the elemental into the thinking here. And I think the final tradition that brings part of the elemental has to do with culture and cultural studies, and I mentioned material anthropology, but material culture is also something that is very present, and it's a way to think elements in different iterations and in different ways of existing in this world when they materialize through certain objects and through certain processes. And I think telling the stories, sometimes there are not stories, but there might be narratives, there might be images, there might be certain vignettes about the cultural ways, existences of elements is another tradition that approaches the element, or that brings actually the elemental into the thinking of the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to add that, totally share the background story about the periodic table of elements, and physics, chemistry be my most hated discipline. Sorry if anybody loved that at school. You know, it's just a natural thing. I couldn't do it. But like, it's funny because for me the elemental. First of all, Dimitris was studying chemistry. His project to think about chemistry. So all the knowledge about chemistry in the book comes through, his work basically, and the way the project got together. We got into together. The thinking about the elements of chemistry was really his work. I came from a very plain, as I tell you, the engagement with soil was like, how do I do the elements? Okay, I'm going to take soil as my element, but obviously I knew soil is not an element. So you could say like I'm being very speculative in the way but for me it's quite funnily that the first time I engaged with something in this way was through participating to a training in permaculture that was very influenced by earth-based spirituality, and where the elementals were approached as air, fire, water, earth, and then spirit was the fifth element, which is basically what connects everything. So and in earth-based spirituality, the elements are the interesting thing is that it's not abstract, it's also material in the sense that if you really want to be in affinity and communion with the element earth, working the soil, putting your hands in the ground is part of it. That's why it was in permaculture. It's not just like a training in spirituality, was part of the. But what I want to say by that is that for me, the abstraction, what you were mentioning, like these are the categories of the elements. When confronted with the chemistry of the elements of the periodic table, that was my initial thought too. And until I see how researchers like Dimitris or others in the book take the periodic table or take one element and then they make how did this category come to be? And that this particular work brings an element to life through anthropological work and etc. So I thought that their work is like Joe Masco's chapter, for instance. I didn't know that in the periodic table originally the only elements that were there were what chemists thought was already in the world. So not the human-made elements and the synthesized, let's say, elements. And he talks about how plutonium came to be an element in the periodic table, and he talks about it became that, and he talks about the ubiquity of plutonium. That makes him think of plastic, that usually wouldn't think plastic as an element, but because of its ubiquity and the fact that it has become an element of our life and our world, that is basically stop plastic and the world as we know it collapses, even if we hate it. So it's like this whole thought of how coming from unpacking what plutonium, in the periodic table, how it came to be, and then daring to think, okay, now how do I think further, something that is not in the periodic table, but what if I think it as if it would be in the periodic table? So these connections only become possible if you say, I'm going to think together the elements of the periodic table as these irreducible abstractions, and the elemental as something that makes me think as the media through which all this circulates. So I think that's what Dimitris was saying also. So I'll just give another example.
Thank you very much, very clear. And I think we do not have to apologize with people who love chemistry, because now we love too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now we are fans.
Good. So there is a question and a hand here in the pub, 2 hands. Maybe Anastasia is the person who posed the question online. Maybe do you want to intervene, or I read the question? So in your book, do you also raise the question of what will be the role of soil in the future? Sorry, it was a question. In your book, do you also raise the question what will be the role of soil in the future? You think we can see soil as this kind of laboratory for the future?
Well, it's a beautiful question, actually. And I don't really address it in the book, but you could say that in a way, in this chapter, I mean. You could say that in a way, the way I say that we can learn from soil. You know, like other scholars, other people are saying, like Astrid and Neymas, what do we learn from water, right? So it's not, it's this kind of idea traversing, kind of ethical impulse in the environmental humanities of trying to learn from the modern human world to change our practices, etc. So the idea in the book about breakdown that I explore, that we can learn from soil to embrace breakdown and to think ourselves as part of that process. I wouldn't say that's the future, but it sounds a little bit. But again, it was for me a provocation for myself too, as somebody who previously had been so engaged in what it is to care for things so that they thrive and survive and endure and have a flourishing life. Breakdown seems like the opposite. To embrace breakdown is basically seems like the opposite. We care for things so that they don't break down, obviously. So for me, it was like, that's what does it, you know, it provoked me also in that way. And thinking of a world where everything that we make should be able to become soil again. Yes. Maybe it's one speculative thought for the future. We cannot live in a world where things don't become soil again. It's just basically not sustainable for the future. So, I mean, it makes me a bit shivery because obviously that seems impossible. And it seems also like a world, how weird that world will be, you know, like, so yeah, that's maybe one, but I don't really address it in a kind of thing of soil for the future, but maybe that's one thought for that.
Thank you. And thinking at the elemental, through this concept of breakdown, it also connects to life and death concepts in the way that it is not anymore a vitalist approach, but it has something more, probably. It makes us think something more.
Yeah.
So thank you. There are 2 people here, 3 people. So if you kindly could come here.
I can bring them the mic.
Oh, I can. No, because no, they have. Yeah, they have to come close because otherwise the people at home cannot hear. Thank you.
So do you want to come to so that people at home can hear you?
Yes.
Also?
Sorry. It's the new brave word, right?
Yeah, we get to move our bodies instead of sitting.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a lot of pressure now to put on the questions, which was a little bit just more of an engagement. Thank you. I'm Ellen Spiro, MIT Station 1, and I've also had the pleasure of visiting here for the past few months. And so I think I'd like to, first of all, thank you for this super exciting project. I know many of the authors in the volume and just really excited about the approach and the provocation. I am a historian of science and technology and in material science. And so I spend most of my time collaborating with scientists and engineers, and I also have a applied chemistry background in thinking more ecologically and equitably. So maybe I come from that side of people who still love the periodic table and didn't fall asleep then. So in that genre, knowing the type of interdisciplinary and creative thinking that it takes to achieve this type of project with so many authors and really across disciplines, I would just love to know more about your thought process and also maybe how you hope that this type of work is used also in the teaching of scientists and engineers. Because I think one of the real opportunities that we have here in thinking about STS, engaged STS in the environmental humanities, is to really make those bridges more stable to converse upon when we're using each other's language and a lot of multiple types of translation. So I would just love to know more about your hopes of how we can use this to create more collaboration and conversation and maybe more social and political change in environmental action with scientists. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great question, and is actually not just a question, it is a major challenge. And I don't think, as much as I'd love that this happens, I don't think that this book can contribute much in this direction, simply because it's too much still on the side of reflecting on elements and the elemental from a social theory, social science, science and technology studies, cultural studies point of view, and doesn't go far enough in order to be able to open a discussion with scientists. And I know that also I have empirical evidence for that, because two of the people, I won't mention them here, but they are very, very well known in the field of green chemistry. I've been working for the past years, and I've been working both as doing research in their, doing field work in their labs, but also as people I've been applying for grants together, and we've been working and managing grants together. So when the book was published, I gave them the book, and I said, well, this is one of the outcomes of this collaboration. And they told me quite sincerely that they find very hard. They like thinking and reading about chemistry, but very hard to connect and find the relevance to the work they are doing. So I think there is a long way to go in order to do this. But I think what you are saying is also something that we had in mind, and eventually something that I'd like to see, because overcoming the boundaries that we mentioned is also closing the gap that exists and is very present in many ways between sciences, specifically here, chemistry, chemical engineering, environmental engineering, some of the biosciences, perhaps soil sciences, plant sciences.
The microbiome as well, it's really much into chemistry.
Yeah, and the social science, social theory, humanities side. So it's very difficult, but it's something that we'd like to contribute to. Now, having said that, these difficulties, on the other hand, I think that one of the things that the book tries to do is not to say, look, there is a lot of pollution, there is a lot of destruction, there is a lot of degradation, the environmental effects are severe, the time scales are huge and go well beyond the lifespan of a product. So of certain elements out there, so we are doing so much damage. So to somehow to expose chemical practice, and here we tried as much as we could, not all of the authors in the same way, but as much as we could, not to just do that, not to expose chemistry as something that creates this. And I think to a certain extent we managed it in order, because we simply do not think that this is a vehicle, this is not a trajectory of change, and we wanted to do it, to have a practical contribution to change, even if a book can have a very minor contribution, very, very minor, and also to overcome this large gap. So it's not about exposing something or revealing something, and that's why some people that we love are not in the book, because they would have this approach, which we think is important, because you learn about the destruction also from this war. But we wanted to open the discussion and say, so where do we need to bring chemicals and chemistry in order to create change? That's the gesture somehow of the book.
Yeah, maybe I think. Yeah, of course. We can pass to copies so that people can look at it. So just bringing from that, I would say that, like to summarize in a bit with the idea that we don't want to position ourselves outside. And I think STS has come a long way from that time where STS people were sociologists who went out in the labs and then they looked at the scientists like if they were, you know, other alien creatures that they could study as if it's an outside practice. So science and technology is an outside practice, and we know better because we come from the social, the ethical, and the humanistic perspective. And the, you know, like, so this kind of position, I think we've come, not us, but whole STS has come a long way out of that. And there is a lot of interesting work in trying to discuss with the scientists. And from my own personal experience in trying to work with soil scientists, and rather than studying them, it's as Dimitris said, it's difficult, but I found that it's very interesting that I usually found scientists that want to work together when it's around a problematic that not that necessarily they understand what I'm doing or I understand what they do, but that we meet in a problem that we are interested in. And that can take a lot of time to also develop. So one of my collaborator scientists in Warwick, he's a professor of soil science, and we spent talking 2 years now. We've been meeting for coffee with him and an engineer and a sociologist who studies toxicity, and we meet together, talk about what can we do together. And now we are getting to a project that we think we would do something together that could, because sometimes one of the things that this scientist tells me is that he likes discussing with me because I understand the science and I'm interested in the science itself. Because when we talk, like if we come with the questions of, oh, this is terrible, you know, this is what's happening, and with the kind of language I would use, it doesn't mean that they are not concerned in the same way for those things. It just doesn't pass through the way they write their articles and their papers and they do their research and their outputs in the same way. I mean, this is something that probably many in the room know when they're working with scientists. But I want to say that for me, it's not about, for us, it's not about being outside. It's about being implicated. And we are implicated in our everyday life because we all benefit and live from that stuff. So it's not just, and the scientists, you know, in the same way, besides the conceptual discussions, it's also about we share the same world, we share the same materials, we share the same spaces.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Critique is key for us, but it's also nowadays too easy. You know, we have also to make a step forward and to try to build together something which is generative for everybody. So there is another one, two other more. Petra, do you want to come here?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Petra, I'm one of those students of the Environmental Humanities Master that was mentioned before. So my question is for you, Professor Bellacasa, and it is about soil quality assessment. So we know that the way soil science and indigenous cultures address the soil is very different, sometimes also contrasting. So I was wondering if, you know, like there is a way that these two ways coexist and overcome their binary approach, to say. And a second question connected to this, last year during the Biennale, I had the opportunity to participate in a soil chromatography workshop. So I don't know, have you ever heard about this? Yeah, it's a way I will work on this, and I think that could be a way to overcome this binary between the scientific approach and more like indigenous, but more about the complexity of the soil, as you addressed in your paper. Thank you very much.
Could you explain in whatever the time you need what chromatography is for?
It's a way to through a process that I think Pfeiffer process to understand the interaction between the inorganic and organic compounds, elements within the soil, but it's not like scientific in the way we know it, because it's more about the interaction you see in a mandala. It's also very beautiful to see. I met this artist who did exhibition with these mandalas, and it's not scientific because you don't have numbers, objective way to address it, but you should compare them. So I think this is quite interesting in the way to address soil.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's a fascinating and very complex question, because now I can go on, and we can talk also after if you like, because on the one hand I would like to go back to what I know and say I can give examples of people who are trying to think through particularly indigenous ways of treating the soil or relating with soil, and then contrasting them and often opposing them with what the scientists who come and try to so-called help will do. And then the way the scientists are, because soil science also, because of its history, has been married to a kind of, the agricultural complex, and, it's only recently, a bit like what Dimitris described with his chemistry, with his research on chemistry, it's only very, very recently that the environmental or the ecological has come through to Western soil science to change the way, for instance, bringing biology to the heart of the discipline, while before it was all about physicochemical processes. So that has changed a lot, and but from what, like in places where, what I would like to try myself with my work is give examples of places where those boundaries are broken or experimented with. And for instance, for me, when I first learned about soil, it was, as I explained, in permaculture practices. And permaculture, as if people know here, blends and mixes a lot of everything, basically everything is brought in, and sometimes there has been a self-critique and an external critique of permaculture for maybe stealing ideas from indigenous practices without really, at the time, a bit like honoring, thinking they were honoring them, but actually basically not very much honoring. So there is a self-critique of that, but like basically everything is good. It's just like, what do we do together to experiment and think of better ways? And in that particular aspect of ecological practice or ecological design, they bring notions that they learn from soil science and soil microbiology, and at the same time as they will bring things that come, well, a mandala, as you say, so I could see myself participate to some kind of connected thing where you would have. So I am very interested in looking for those places where those boundaries are broken and explored. And in terms of assessing soil quality, well, it's really complicated, because soil quality obviously is linked to, if it comes through, what do we do with soil quality? So if soil quality is about what are we going to plant in the soil, if you are in an urban space, the soil scientists need to work with a range of environmental regulations, which means that the way they're going to look at the soil is basically, is it going to poison the people? Because so they are going to be, the science is not operating outside a whole complex of policy and practice. And therefore, if you want to think about other ways of testing the soil, basically you need to do it without telling the planners, because otherwise you might be told that you cannot do your community garden in that corner of the city. So there are many different, I'm talking about my context, which is an urban, Western European context. So I'm not confronted to people who have an indigeneity, of which they would say in Britain, here's how we treat the soil since our ancestors. There is basically none of that. So it's a very different context, so I wouldn't be able, but basically I'm interested in looking at places where those boundaries are broken. And I'd love to talk to you more about this stuff.
Thank you. There was one more question down there. Yeah, thank you. We have 2 more questions, and then I think we are high.
Hi, thank you for the lovely talk. Thank you for introducing your book. I have my background in the humanities as well, but about half a year ago I had the chance to drop in on this STS lecture about soil sequestration, and then something from there popped into my mind when you were talking earlier. There was this kind of development in understanding of what and how fast breaks down in soil that had changed, or the development in that thinking, which was that before there was an understanding that there is complexity is like the determining factor, that how complex a compound is that determines how fast it decomposes in soil. And when it popped into my mind when you were talking about expanding the notion of soil as a medium of breakdown, and if we start thinking of soil as a medium, or what is the medium of say a breakdown of a tradition, of a social structure, of a mode of production, then this I just want to kind of throw it out there. You encounter this idea of complexity as a determining factor of how something breaks down, and I think that is it comes into that there is a certain, that this kind of approach inscribes a certain hierarchy to compounds, and that's what I found interesting. I wanted to kind of ask for your opinion about it.
Thank you so much.
That's really interesting. I don't know if I thought I find really, thank you for going with me and trying and thinking, like both with soil and thinking, because what did we think of, as you say, how a social system breaks down and the ratios, by trying to find which are the ratios, or like scientists who talk about ratios of how fast does something decompose in soil. And the first thing I was thinking brought me back to Petra's question on different systems of thinking. And I really love to see how this project, where it was called Soil My Andes, and they, farmers who have to measure the biodiversity in the soil. And the more biodiversity you have of microorganisms, obviously, the quicker things decompose. And obviously decomposition also creates carbon, so that's why you don't want to break too much the soil, because all these activities break carbon and bring it to the air. So there is a complexity of, as you mentioned. But there was a very interesting project where the farmers were just like taking their underwear out and putting it in the soil, and then taking it out after a month. And the one who had their underwear more broken, so they took pictures of it, and the one who was the winner, because the soil was the most biodiverse. So basically, maybe an interesting thing that you made me think about, and I hadn't thought, is thinking, and in permaculture I talk a lot about diversity as part of a very important part of a system to be resilient. So if you have a system that is not diverse, it doesn't have much future. And they bring it from ecology into society. So the idea is that a more resilient society and a better society is to be diverse. So it's this social permaculture thing. But for me, that brings also a question that maybe I want to throw there, is that as much as I do that, I love thinking notions transversally. So breakdown in science, breakdown in ethics, breakdown in thinking of futures. This is obviously, I always come back to be careful of how do I think that? What does it mean to think society by dialoguing with scientific concepts? So it's a constant go and forth of the fact that science is not a new blueprint, so how society must work, obviously. And this back and forth I find really interesting for me to think, because then you come back and say, well, be careful, because breakdown, what does it mean to embrace breakdown? And for whom breakdown is a good thing? And why should it be an ethical thing to break things down? And basically for me, my conclusion until now is that it's an ethical thing for me as an inheritor of the white industrial capitalist complex, that has benefited me and my people. But actually I have more an obligation to break down of what I have inherited than people who actually have been the broken down. the people who we have broken down to extract their life energy, basically. So like playing with this, so I'm interested in what you are saying, and also thinking, how do we avoid if we are trying to think about societal breakdown? Not to just to bring this notion, I mean to bring it carefully and to think what would it mean to think of, and I think complexity, as you mentioned, is fundamental there, because that complexity brings the situatedness of that. We cannot speak about that in the same way, depending where we are positioned.
Yes. Thank you very much. We have 3 more questions, and then I think we have to end. Okay, maybe
Or we can do them
very short, or after the. So Anna.
Thank you, and thanks so much for exploring the ideas in the book with us today. So I have a question that may seem polemical, but it really isn't, which is about the difference between the conceptual difference and kind of civic and political difference between focusing on chemicals as opposed to elements, and the choice you made of in focusing on elements in the book. If I think about chemical term, chemosociality, chemical ethnography, there's been a lot in the social science and humanities that has pushed towards that direction. And in some ways, I can see the appeal of focusing on chemicals because it's more tangible, perhaps, than element, which is much more elusive and at the same time productive in ways that the book shows. So I just wonder whether you thought about that or whether you settled on elements without thinking the chemicals were as useful, perhaps, the concept.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, which makes sense in many ways, and definitely makes sense for us as we develop the project through trying to making a differentiation between chemicals and elements. And I wouldn't want to have a clear-cut differentiation because probably it doesn't exist, or I don't have it. I don't know. I don't have it. But there is a difference, and the difference is, I think what I tried to mention before is that the chemicals brings us too close to the actual material substances, which are the processes of mainly of human activity. Of course, we talk here of anthropogenic chemicals, and then we see it as part of the binarism that possibly is there. Elements, which is not, of course, the same as chemicals, is very different, but it allowed us to play more and to think more with the idea of the elemental and these material social formations that we would like to see with elements. So I think it's more explorative, the difference it became, and I think in the beginning, in some of the projects, we used them interchangeably to a certain extent. But then, as we started discussing with the people, and then I think it was when the first idea came, it was in 2016, and we had the meeting of the Society for the Social Studies of Science in Barcelona, and we had a panel with all these people and few other people, actually, I think they were there, that we discussed the project and it started shaping in a different direction. So I think we grew, we developed the project, and the project grew together, and we, of course, with it, as we've been thinking of it, so it was not a pre-existing idea. Now, in my work, I was more the work chemicals rather than elements, but I'd like to see it against the horizon that is opened up through this work on elements and the elemental. So I think for me it's both. It's elements and elemental, and it's not just elements, because there is quite a lot in the history, less in STS, but much more in the history and philosophy of science. There is significant work on the history of elements. And this is not part of this, and it's there. It has informed this. I mean, some of the text in this book, but there is already a lot of work. But the elements and the elemental and its implications, I think, is something that we want to open. So that's.
There is one question from Lucilla Barchetta. Lucilla, do you want to? Oh, yeah. Online, do you see?
Yeah, we see you in the screen here.
Yes,
Yeah.
we hear you.
First of all, thank you. I look forward to reading the book. I have a question that maybe resonates with one that has been already raised from the audience. I was wondering, I was thinking of what is the place of social conflict in the theoretical contribution that this book is trying to build, and where social conflict lies in the elemental words or in the word of elements, and what could be, from your perspective, a social conflict theory of elements. Thank you.
You can start. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously a great question for Dimitris and I, because we are, in different ways thinking of social conflict in our work. About the project itself, we didn't set up with that in mind, except for the aspect of obviously environmental destruction, and that some of the authors in particular we knew were interested in that and were quite engaged STS thinkers, and also our co-editors, so Natasha Myers, are people who are, who are thinking about how technoscience and justice in particular, and injustice in particular, are entangled. So many of these people, even if not explicit in their work, maybe they are themselves engaged in different ways. And you can see that in some of the chapters that is more present. So you would see it on Corey Hayden's chapter also, is very present. Michelle Murphy's, Joe Masco's, even if it looks like a very, it's a historian perspective, it's there big time. Other chapters are more playful and don't necessarily engage with social conflict directly. So that's just for thinking about the book. Now, speculatively about what could be a social conflict theory, as theory of the elements from social conflict. I think I'm not sure what I would say like as a general theory, but I would say that in the friction between, basically it would be maybe about a question of violence, and a question of what kind of violence is implicated in different understandings of the elements. And we've mentioned the elements as a common vital, I'm thinking more the elemental, let's say. So thinking the elemental as the commons that are vital for existence, but from the perspective of chemistry, we can think about, Dimitris can talk more about that, but how engagements with chemistry, and that's something that is very important in Dimitris' work, is how engagements with chemistry can engage in alternative ways of bringing ecological practice into the practice of chemistry from the perspective of what he calls modern social movements. So their social conflict is obviously a big part of the question. I don't know if I have exactly now an answer of what would be a social, but I like the sound of it, a social conflict theory of the elements, and I will definitely make me think.
Yeah, very briefly, I think that's a really good question, and at least for me, is the central question for the whole project. This project, but also other projects relate to elements and chemicals that we are doing. And I think it is actually about bringing the social conflicts, or perhaps we should call them the socio-ecological conflicts that are the outcome of chemicals, or the action, the effects of chemicals in societies and ecologies, that we should bring back these conflicts into the making, use, production, circulation, afterlife of chemicals. So for me, the aim is to bring back these conflicts and find a way to incorporate these conflicts, because this is actually what bringing the milieu back into the chemicals means. It's a conflict that is out there, and it has an enormous implications, and in a certain extent, without a solution for that, we won't be able to think of any form of transition, because this transition involves dealing with the conflicts emerging out of our use and production of chemicals. We cannot not do it simply because they are ubiquitous and they are in 95% of the objects that we use every day. From these 95% of objects, only 5 or 10% are environmentally or clinically or socially benign. This means the majority of the rest has severe consequences. So the conflict is there, and sometimes it's expressed in social movements, in other environmental mobilizations, in radical action. Most of the time is not expressed. Sometimes it's expressed in the destruction of ecosystems, or sometimes it's expressed in interspecies collaborations that try to deal with the effects of these chemicals. So I think this is the central question in the way you formulate it, is bringing back the conflict into the chemistry, but without finding the easy solution of saying, oh, we know what the problem is, but is how do we change chemical practice to incorporate and think of the conflict that is there. I think this is the major challenge, and it's not an easy one, and it's not possibly going to be solved, and there will be, because simply the rate of destruction is much faster, much higher than the rate of solutions that we humans can offer. So, but
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bianca? Well, I think she had to leave. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I'd like to ask you, I appreciate your work on the matter, because I've got to admit this. So my question will kind of go that way. I want to take this opportunity. I won't have it very soon again. First of all, I'd like to ask you, I like this notion of the elemental as relationship, as relation, let's say, as generative and emergent. But I'm asking, I'm immersed in this kind of reading at the moment, what are the overlaps and the differences between how matter, as emergent matter, has been defined, or phenomena? I've got in mind different feminist, post-humanist philosophers, anthropologists, and stuff in mind. That's the yeah. I know it's a real. I haven't read your paper. I understood is a relation. You know, the elemental is a relation. But as I understood these other notions, and the other, because it comes so strongly across this notion of the elemental as relation, where, and I'm referring to some of the questions that have been raised, where is the ethical aspect? In your short presentation about the soil and all these kind of linkages with the kind of cultural, economic interest and perspective comes, or probably will come very clear. But so where if you could talk a bit more about this ethical aspects as in terms of matters of care. This matters of care for me, it inspired me very much, because I've been studying for many years this indigenous epistemology, ontology in the north of Australia. And there, the matter of care is paramount. It's declined in different ways, but is perhaps the most important social principle and practice in everyday life, and it articulates relationships with everything, not only with other people, but with the soil. And the soil, it is, they call it country, is in reality, I call it a multi-dimensional tangle of relations, where everything is connected, and the humans are not certainly at the center or in control of these connections. So where is this aspect of the matter of cares rather than concerns, matter of concerns or ethics? Because I think that starting from your work, this matter of cares includes aspects like energy, like love, like other dimensions that other approaches on ethics tend to marginalize. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's not just a question, it's like a beautiful engagement of, and connecting things together, so, and with your work. So I'd like to read and talk more about this. So I think I would connect a bit with what Dimitris said about the project just now, because for us, there is one of the things I would say about the project itself, in terms of its ethicality, is that for the idea of thinking our, let's say, our belonging to the elemental, and how do we belong to elements, how do elements belong with us, how we are made in the way scientific tells the story, abstracts the story of all these elements that then they have periodic table and they tell a story about who we are that is relevant to Western cosmology, scientific Western stories that we tell ourselves that have been very much infused by the way science sees the world. So like the ethical is intrinsic to that, because that means that the way we engage with them also makes, it's going to make how this matter circulates in the world, how this matter is being made. And obviously, again, we talk about the limitations of this book. It's not going to change chemical practice, so that's for sure. But the idea of as people who have ethics, so humans, let's say, more than human ethics, is that simply everything, how we think, every way that we conceptualize the elements, for me, is part of contributing to how are they going to be made and making us. So maybe, and that's a bit the idea of matters of care, is that we are obliged by matter in the same way as we are participating to the generation of how matter is arranged. I have to say, though, that for me matter, because the discussion comes from obviously the engagement with matters of concern in Latour, etc., but it also comes from the fact that, as Roberta mentioned before, is very much about connecting the feminist materialist, but feminist Marxist materialist tradition of the discussion of care with modern human ontologies discussion. So for me, the notion of matter comes very much from that tradition rather than the new materialist, which is not to say that I don't think there is affinity and connection, there is, but for me that's how I came to think of the notion of matter as it's more Marxist ontology. So it's a much more humanistic tradition than the new materialist. So that's where I came from. So this is the feminist tradition that rethought care as part of the fabric of the world and the work of care, as labor, as a politics, as an ethics. So for me, the notion of matter that I work with is much more linked to that kind of than the idea of matter as a beautiful abstraction of what everything is made of. So in a way, the book has very much that at its heart. Otherwise, in terms of the interventions themselves, not all of them are explicitly having an ethics that they, explicitly, let's say, verbalize in writing. But we do think that the fact of not situating ourselves outside is in itself an ethical endeavor. We cannot be outside all this stuff. We are not outside, and anyway, you cannot touch things if you put yourself outside. So I've considered myself a critical theorist, but critique in that sense of being engaged and implicated. So maybe that's like the fundamental ethical principle is to being engaged ethically in that way, but also engaged by the material constitution of the world. Like that's what makes us, and that we are constantly co-making. So in my paper, it talks very much about the co-creation of us with soils, and how soils are a co-creation of all these multi-species arrangements, including now the humans in them, because all that we do as anthropogenic interventions makes the soils of this earth. So yeah, maybe that's a matter of care there. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think
that it must be really
I'm
late.
Sorry, we are
very impatient.
I'm sorry because I would continue to speak about those things, but I think that this idea of being implicated is a very idea to end with our discussion today. So thank you everybody for being here, both in presence and online. Thank you for the questions. Thanks to the admin and technical support here. Thanks to NICHE. We are in a beautiful room for those you cannot see online. And of course, thanks to our super guests, Dimitris and Maria. Thank you very much. A big applause. Thank you very much.